water flows downhill towards money. Okay. And
Sure.
the three counties have a lot of money. And I've been telling my rural friends who don't want anything to change in water, I go, it's going to change sooner or later because the vast majority of voters in this state are in, the Sun Corridor. And when those voters need the water, they're going to get it. And you could either set the ground rules for that now in terms of here's a market-based system, right, where we could profit off selling them the water or whatever. Or if you don't set up that framework, what's going to happen is the folks of the suburbs are just going to one day wake up and take it. That's how it's going to work.
Welcome back to The Drip Line. This is our second episode where I sat down with Representative Alexander Kolodin. He represents Legislative District 3 in Arizona. He's also running for Secretary of State next year. Alex says that himself and Gail Griffin are the two legislators whose opinions on water are most often sought among their colleagues at the legislature. He talks with me about a few topics, mainly about how water will be managed and possibly marketed in the future of Arizona, how that impacts both rural water owners, users, and urban, suburban water users and managers. And we talk a little bit about one system of water management called correlative rights, which is adopted by some states already. Alex goes on to advocate for an adoption of free market correlated water rights. We get into a little bit of how wise that may or may not be. I don't share all of Alex's opinions and projections about how that would shake out in practice. But Alex does a great job overall, I think, at making his case for the marketization of water. You will be the judge of whether it seems like a good idea, but without further ado, I bring you episode 2 of The Drip Line.
Just how luxurious it is to live in a city, especially one like Scottsdale, right? Where on a day-to-day basis, if you have a house in Scottsdale, you don't have to think about, okay, how am I going to source my water? Where's my well at or whatever? You've got a big municipal water system. You've got a very wealthy city with very capable people, working on making sure that your needs are supplied. The problem is, that unless you focus on the macro issue, eventually, even the city of Scottsdale is not going to be able to make sure that its residents' needs are supplied because we're already seeing this. Water rates have gone up dramatically over the past 5 years. And I always like to give this example, which is at the beginning of my first term, it was a crisis that water bills in Rio Verde were $900 a month or $700 a month. And now there are water bills in Scottsdale that are $700, $900 a month, right? And now we just kind of consider that to be normal. And just wait till we get the Colorado River cutbacks in the next couple of years. And then we're really going to see suburbanites go, what the hell's going on with my water bill? And it's going to start impacting people more and more.
Yeah, I saw some floor footage of you on a vote for a bill. I can't remember which bill it was, but you spoke to the potential for Arizona to lose up to 100% of its CAP water supplies. Do you? I mean, if you could set if you could make a bet, what do you think the odds are that Arizona loses all of its CAP? I mean, if you feel comfortable making that bet, I know it's a very complex and unpredictable thing, but where's your level of concern? Let's say that Arizona is going to take a massive hit to its CAP supplies.
If I was laying an over underline, I'd take the over bet on 25% CAP cutback, might take the over line on 40% CAP cutback.
Okay. And just in case anyone doesn't know what CAP means, that's the Central Arizona Project, a massive canal system that delivers water from the Colorado to Central Arizona. It makes up, I want to say, 40 some percent of Phoenix's water supply. So municipal water supply. So pretty
Makes up
big
a hundred.
chunk.
It makes up 100%. Well, I should say 100%. The CAP system, Salt and Verde, those three combined make up 100%, right? Everything else that we use, because we're in an initial AMA with the safe yield goal, has to be recharged, right? So anything else we use from any other source, quote unquote, right? That's all got to be recharged. Our only actual supply is from those three surface water sources.
Right. And the other thing you're talking about is if we use groundwater, that has to be recharged per AMA restrictions, um, safe yield as it's called. I'm curious, let's say Phoenix gets a 50, 40, whatever, let's say 40% cutback to its CAP supplies. What are some of the key things you see happening in the wake of that event in terms of regulation, in terms of economics, in terms of politics? Like, we get the bad news, late 2026. Sorry, guys, it's just how it is. What are you planning on happening in the future after that point that you feel
I don't
pretty,
know.
relatively certain?
I don't know that it's proper to talk about planning on things happening after that,
Sure.
because I think that'll put us into a whole new world. Here's the things that I could see happening after that. One, the suburbs are going to be fully awake at that point. They're going to realize that between the three counties, which is what we're called in the water world, Pima, Pinal, and Maricopa counties, right? Those are called the three counties in the water world. About 75% of our state's population lives in those three counties, maybe even a little bit more. And the voters of those counties are going to realize that what they've realized at almost every other issue, which is that they run the state. And they're going to proceed accordingly. I think they're going to take a much more aggressive line about protecting their prerogatives vis-a-vis rural water users. And I've been telling my rural friends who don't want anything to change in water, I go, it's going to change sooner or later, because the vast majority of voters in this state are in the Sun Corridor, and when those voters need the water, they're going to get it. And you could either set the ground rules for that now, in terms of here's a market-based system, right, where we can profit off selling them the water or whatever. Or if you don't set up that framework, what's going to happen is the folks of the suburbs are just going to one day wake up and take it. That's how it's going to work, because this is politics, and the side with the highest number of votes who want something for a long enough time, they get it, right? And the suburbs are going to want your water when CAP system gets hammered by 40%.
Yeah, that's, I think it's sometimes spoken quietly, sometimes just exists as speculation on the rural side of the state that Central Arizona is coming for your water one day. What I tell people is imagine you're the state water manager. You've got to just make the numbers go in the right direction so that people literally have water. There's not other good options. Desal plants are not getting a green light from Mexico. I don't think most people believe we're going to get a massive pipeline from the Mississippi. Recycling technology is only going to go so far. Desalinating brackish groundwater is problematic for various reasons. But hey, there's really good water sitting there in rural Arizona. And people are going to be thirsty for it. So, this is what I tell people, Alex, because I've heard some say up here in Cochise County, when I say up, I mean in terms of elevation. Yeah, you're going to get a pipeline from somewhere, and that I'm like, you think even if Arizona gets a pipeline from some out of state source, that they're also going to pipe some of that all the way up to Cochise County, an extra 1,000 feet, when there's only going to be this much, and Central Arizona is going to want all of it. And I say, are you sure you want a pipeline to your your rural area? Because water flows downhill much easier than it goes uphill. Um, but yeah,
Well, let's be precise there. Water flows downhill towards money. Okay. And
sure.
the three counties have a lot of money, right? And so that is where water will eventually flow, right? In one way or the other, towards votes or towards money, but either way, it gravitates towards the same place. And that's why I think that um, some some rural agricultural interests might be being a little short-sighted by trying to do the intrastate negotiation over the Colorado River Use Agreement in such a way that the majority of the cutback falls on the cap system. Because what they're doing is that if they do that, what they'll be doing is putting the suburbs in a much more desperate position and kind of accelerating that aggressive pace of okay, well, how can we get water out of rural Arizona? I think that we've built a lot of resilience, especially in Maricopa County. We built an awful lot of resilience into our water system. We're building out the toilet to tap system. Scottsdale's had essentially toilet to tap for many years. They couldn't put it directly in the pipes; they put it into the aquifer or whatever. Phoenix is building a huge wastewater treatment facility. It's contracting with a lot of other cities to do it. Um, we're getting very, very efficient, right? So there's a lot of resilience to deal with the smaller cutback, but all the resilience in the world can't help you deal with a 50% cutback. Just not possible.
Yeah, just to be clear, the point you're making is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there are agricultural water users who in Yuma, the western side of the state, who get their water directly from the Colorado. They have the most senior Colorado River water rights in the state. So they're the by law, so to speak, or by at least case law and agreements, they would be the last to have to give up their water rights in the face of cutbacks. And you're saying maybe they shouldn't hold on to their seniority of water rights so strongly because of the impacts it will have on the rest of agriculture throughout the state when Central Arizona bearing those cutbacks instead means they're just going to go out to rural Arizona for their water anyway. Is that right?
Yeah, or do I mean, look, if you got senior river rights, you got senior river rights. That's economically valuable, whatever. But be reasonable at the rates at which you sell it into the cap system. Um, so because I think got to look at the long term of that play, right? Is we need to maintain a good balance in this state between different types of water users, and if that balance gets too far out of whack, it's not going to be good for anybody.
Yeah, I think there's no mistake or real controversy about the fact that agriculture is going to cede much of its water demands to municipal, residential, industrial needs. It's the timelines will be interesting. The price points will be interesting for sure, and we'll see how that all plays out. I'll put forward to you a little bit of my speculation. I'll be curious to hear how it lands for you. I think what we're seeing right now with this kind of these big moves and these big defensive moves when it comes to rural groundwater regulations is that essentially the Farm Bureau, those who represent the deepest pockets within the agricultural world, they're pushing to have no or weak regulations that might diminish their water rights or water duties because they know that ag to urban is coming. They know they're going to be selling their water at some point, and so they want as much water to sell as possible, right? Like they don't want to have regulations today that start diminishing their water rights because then they'll have less to sell once push comes to shove and they have to sell that water. That's my sense of kind of like what's going on with the groundwater management battle. But I'd be curious to hear your
Well,
take.
I think there's some truth that with the proviso, like when we talk about, I don't know, taking water out of Cochise County, pumping it to the three counties.
Not going to happen.
Yeah, that's a long way away, right? Like,
Yeah.
because you've got to build the infrastructure. It's very expensive, things would have to get a lot worse, right, for something like that. But when we talk about ag to urban is coming, right, we're really talking about it coming within the three counties, especially Pinal, right? And ag to urban is a great idea, right? It's essentially a variation of my water exchange proposal, a more limited version. But I think everybody who thinks about the issue realizes ag to urban has to work. And frankly, I don't really care that much if like the Farm Bureau is trying to maximize their rights, right? Because it's just like I'm probably the oddest person in the legislature. It's like I don't care if Farm Bureau is trying to maximize their rights. And I'm happy when the Indian water rights get settled. And for both of those, it's exactly the same reason, which is until you have definite rights, you can't have a functional market. I almost don't care how the rights are allocated as an initial condition. They're allocated to the farmers. Great. The Indians solidify their rights. Great. Okay, now we know who owns them. Okay, now we can proceed to have a functional market, which is what we actually need to address our state's water issues. So fine. Now here's the catch with the ag to urban stuff, or not the ag to urban, but I should say with the rural groundwater regulation stuff. Is we know we're going to have some form of it because it's a major negotiating issue for the Colorado River use agreement, right? It materially impacts our negotiating position. And so for me, like the big question with the rural stuff, because the state's disconnected when it comes to water. The three counties are a different state. Aside from the transformations, water under current law can't flow between the basins. So three counties are a different state. And so really, I'm happy with almost any rural system of regulation. I'm happy for that to be just as light as it could possibly be, so long as that's sufficient to strengthen our state's negotiating position on water.
As long as it's sufficient. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what's sufficient, and who's going to make that determination. But speaking on behalf of my rural communities, I hope that these regulations are not too light for the sake of having something like a sustainable water supply going into the future. Before we get a little bit further down that path of rural regulations and markets for water, I'd
I
like
prefer not
to,
that. By the way, I prefer
yeah,
not to have regulations at all. I prefer to have a correlative rights system. But since
right. We'll get to
since
that.
the Freedom Caucus, we're the only people who seem to think this way. It looks like the establishment Republicans and the Democrats are going to instead do a system of rural water regulation, which is not great for folks out in rural Arizona because now you've got the government controlling, the most vital resource for your life, and God help you if you get on the bad side of the powers that be, right?
You're making it very hard for me to stay focused because I've got a lot to say on this issue. I think about it probably as much as anyone does. But before we get there, I think it'll be interesting for people to hear a little bit more about the suburban metropolitan side of the equation. And one question I have is like, what do you see in terms of water use regulations for residential people? Do you think we'll see soon things like we see in Las Vegas, where there's going to be limits on how much water can be used to water a lawn or the size of new swimming pools and things like this?
Do I think we're gonna try to fix the problems with our socialist system by adding more socialism? Um, like I hope not. Here's the thing about suburbanites, of which I am one proudly, is like most people who haven't done a deep dive on the water issue, they tend to extrapolate based on what they see. And so they ask questions that are like very logical if you haven't dug into the numbers, like, oh, why do we have green lawns in the desert? Like, whatever. Okay. Here's the truth, though. Okay. Household, like residential household water usage, has decreased since the 50s, not decreased per capita. Okay. Decreased, period. Even though we have, like, what is it? 10 times more people living in the state than the 50s, right? Something like that. 7, 10 times. Okay. It's decreased, right? So one household now uses almost 10 times less water than one household back in the 50s used. Okay. And not only that, but once the household uses that water, like a household in the city of Scottsdale, you use your water, whatever, like a large portion of that water winds up getting recycled. Okay. So nothing we can do in terms of suburban water use is going to move the needle. And all we're going to do is make people's lives miserable, almost in some sort of like religious atonement for water use, which is why I firmly oppose these kinds of regulations. Absolutely, your house, your family is not the problem when it comes to our state's water. It's industrial users, right? And I don't want to say they're a problem, right? But they use so much more water as to make your household's water use meaningless. And same thing with agricultural users. They use so much more water as to make your household's water use meaningless. And there's no reason to punish Arizona families when it's simply not going to make a difference.
Yeah, I think it's well, I get a little heartbroken when I hear, especially in from my rural neighbors, about what I don't think are bad things to do, but kind of not very meaningful personal water conservation efforts. I'm like the amount of water you're saving by not using water for X is a fraction of a percentage of what comes out of a pivot in a day or something. If that's not perfectly right, it's very close, right? It's tiny little drops in the bucket that really are not making a difference. I wouldn't try to dissuade someone from being frugal with their water use. I think it's probably a good ethic to promote is frugal water
I think
use.
that's right.
And yeah, I think
But
that'll help.
it can't be
Yeah.
mandated. The reason that you can't mandate it is look, I am a suburban Republican. Okay. I will tell you, the second that you mandate anything about you can't have a lawn or whatever, right? You've now turned Republicans into the most anti, water conservation people in the world, right? That's what makes us Republicans is that if you try to tell us what to do, we're going to assume you're the evil person and we'll usually be right. And then we're going to push very forcefully for the opposite, right? So it can't be that. Absolutely promote the ethic of conservation. By the way, when I grew up, it was in school, swat, don't waste water. Of course, you probably never have schools teach that today because it'd be politically correct, but I still remember because it was just impressed upon us as part of our culture. And that will be a much more powerful way of leveraging the suburbs than trying to tell us what to do.
How do you I mean, if you were in charge of a campaign to get residents more conservation minded, how would you appeal to that in the suburbs? What do you think people would need to hear in order for them to think, maybe I would use less water? This is just kind of like a curious question I have. It's not.
I see. I dispute your prior. I wouldn't waste resources on that campaign. It doesn't matter, and in fact, it distracts people. It
Okay.
elevates an issue that doesn't matter, right? And then you get people distracted focusing on that. Whereas
Sure.
what I have tried to engage the public on water issues where I needed them to help me fight for suburban water interests, the way that I've engaged them is to go, look, for example, there's these 3 hedge funds up at the transfer basin and now they're trying to siphon off your emergency water supply, which they were trying to do with 2201. and I would actually redirect their attention on the big issues in water, because that's where the suburbs could be most impactful, not getting distracted. And it almost is. In politics, we call it shiny objects, right? So suburban water conservation is like a shiny object that actually is harmful if you focus on it because it distracts you.
Mm.
Like, and in terms of like suburban water use, like in our own backyard, here's what I would have people focus on is like, okay, industrial users, like Taiwan Semi, they say they're going to recycle all of their water. Like, has anybody checked? Does anybody ask for what the plans are for that? Um, like that could be good to know. What is your
Mm.
city doing to make sure it's got access to other sources of water, right? Is the city of Scottsdale locking up more supply in the Harquahala? That would be great. Obviously, I'm a little worried about the toilet to tap, like pharmaceuticals getting into the water, all of
Mm.
that. Like, although again, we've been doing it for a long time, we just put it in the aquifer first. But like, hey, who on your suburban water team, who in your group of PCs is like vetting the toilet to tap system to make sure that it has a level of pharmaceutical filtration that's acceptable to you and your community? Do you feel it's safe for your kids? Right? Because you got to get the suburban activists, right? They got to make sure the system feels safe to them before it could really get widespread public support. So get involved and make sure that the way that the system is being set up is one that makes you feel safe with the quality of that water, right? These are the kind of things I'd really be focusing suburban activists on.
Yeah, I'll be writing about the advanced purification process because I'm curious still about the finer details of how that works, what the safe checks are, and I'm sure people are very interested to know as well.
Here's the other thing
Mm.
I'd probably be focused on in terms of suburban activism is like, hey, is there any low hanging fruit left with our purple pipe system? Right? Like, not every golf course has access to purple pipes. Purple pipes are for gray water, right? For them to use gray water instead of fresh water from the aquifer or municipal like fresh water, purified water. Like, hey, where should we be building out our purple pipe infrastructure to maximize conservation per dollar? Like, because the way I see it is like, okay, if our cost of water is X, maybe 400 acre foot, $400 an acre foot, probably gonna be higher than that in the future, right? Like, okay, if that's our cost of water, okay, how can we get water for cheaper than X? Okay, is that building out purple pipes? Hey, maybe we want to do it. But this I think part of the difficulty of the conversation, right? Where rural folks, when they go, okay, well, suburban people focus on like conservation on your plot of land, because that's the way you would do it at rural Arizona. I'm going to focus on conservation on my land, right? Because you're a big water user, it matters how much water you use, right? Like, it doesn't matter how much water my house uses on its land, right? Whereas suburbanites, even like fairly anti-government suburbanites like me, right? Who very much comes from the Goldwater wing of the party. I like to joke, my legislative district is probably like one of the most libertarian leaning Republican legislative districts in the entire state, if not the most libertarian leaning. Okay. But if I went into my legislative district and I said, guys, I have a great way to increase your liberty. Okay. I'm going to run a bill to prohibit municipalities from supplying water service. They would all look at me and go like, Alex, have you gone crazy? Okay. Whereas if I went out to a rural district, even maybe a more moderate rural district, and I said exactly the same thing, they would cheer, they would clap, right? So suburbanites were used to doing water as a municipal civic enterprise, right?
As
It's something
socialists.
that we feel civic minded about. It's not a personal responsibility thing for me to change my use on my land. It's a personal responsibility thing for me to get involved with my city and make sure that my city is providing water in the most effective, efficient, inexpensive, sustainable way possible, right? So you totally have to shift your mindset if you want to do impactful conservative like water policy activism in the suburbs.
Got it. And I'm curious both what your feeling is on this and what, to the extent that you have a sense of it, the feeling of your constituents is on the industrial water use of these data centers and microchippers. I just spoke with, had an interview with Chris Mays, the Attorney General, and she made a comment like, "Do we really want Arizona to be this data center state?" And I hear it actually from lots of different political sides and places that. Um, I don't know. It's an unpopular idea, and there's a lot of worry about the water use. And I'm curious what your take is on the economics and the kind of the hydroeconomics of these data centers and chip fabs.
Yeah, this is like a conversation I was having this weekend with somebody about something that wasn't data center. So it was kind of a similar type thing, right? Which is like if we just stop distorting the market, like I think we would find that water use in the state is much more rational. Okay, so we distort the market. We have this like tax credit for data centers and only for data centers, which doesn't really make a lot of sense because they don't actually produce a lot of jobs and most of the money goes to investors outside of the state. Okay, like if we just equalize the terms for the data centers, maybe we take, you know, and I'll never do anything to raise taxes on net, but maybe we take that data center tax credit, we more broadly distribute it throughout the economy, correct the market distortion. Um, like we might find that our water use in the state was more rational. And in a lot of other ways, right, Arizona is a very like is a very good place for data centers. Like we have a reliable grid, we have Palo Verde, which is major for us. So you would probably still see some data centers, but without this market distortion that like favors data centers to the exclusion of other industries, you might not see quite as much uptake. Now, the other thing about data centers, of course, is that they're paying industrial rates for the water, so they're not getting subsidized water in that sense. So the market distortion is really on the taxation side, where they have a privileged tax position over and above other industries, right? That needs to be more broadly distributed throughout the economy. So that's my view as somebody who's really into the issue. I can tell you, like my constituents are very skeptical of industrial water users. They understand that we need some industrial water users economically. Like I don't think you'd find many people in Scottsdale that though we may be very skeptical of Taiwan Semi's water usage, like you'll find very few people calling for Taiwan Semi to be shut down because it's a major economic driver, lots of jobs, you know, huge economic impact right here in the valley. With data centers, it's not really quite the same because you don't need that many employees to run a data center.
Right. Yeah, that's an interesting point that I think about a lot. It's something I'm actually just not educated about is the employee count for data centers. I know it's much lower than chip manufacturers, but um, whenever I hear, well, you know, jobs creates jobs, I'm like, how many jobs is it creating? Uh, that said, I wonder what you think about. This is a big question, and we'll all forgive you if you don't have some like, you know, well-tuned vision here. But do you think that Arizona's economic development needs to take a certain direction, pursue certain industries because of limited water supplies, besides just less agriculture?
And again, I'm gonna dispute your premises, right? And your premises
Ah,
are that the government should be deciding this, and it's not. What we
well,
need to
no.
do,
I
yeah,
don't mean it in the sense of
yeah.
like a regulatory system, but just in general. Like if you could promote an idea that, you know, let's focus on this kind of business development because
Well,
as informed by limited water supplies. Do you even think that is that a legitimate question or no?
I think that the market distortions need to be removed, and then we will see which industries thrive in this state with our state's level of water availability, right? That is what needs to happen. Now, I will tell you, you know, like as a guy who just got off the top of my head's like, hey, you know, like what might be good, which could be totally wrong because the government is always the last person to know what works. But um, you know, like I think wine is a really good agricultural industry for our state. There's no crop that I am aware of that has as much economic value add per acre foot of water used as wine growing. Our state's terroir for wine growing is really some of the best in the world, in my opinion. It's very similar to the Spanish wine regions, and I always joke about Arizona wine. When it's bad, it's really bad, but when it's good, it's really good. I mean, when it's good, it's some of my favorite wine in the world, far better than what's produced in Europe or California or whatever. It could be a major player on the wine scene. So I think that could be a really good agricultural industry for our state. Obviously, the wine industry is not enough to support the entire state's agricultural economy, but what we ought to be looking at, and when I say we, I don't mean the government. I mean individuals should be looking at is like, okay, like what's the highest value add crop that like we could only really produce in Arizona, or Arizona has some advantage to the production of. Because if you take water out of the picture, we have an advantage to the production of almost everything, right? Sun. I used to have an orange tree in my backyard when I was growing up, and I always have family from back east come visit and be like, hey, that tree, it gives us oranges 3 times a year. We don't do anything. We don't like fertilize it or not do it like, the gardening stuff. We just have a tree. It's in our backyard, and 3 times a year, it's just throwing off oranges like crazy. Oh, I mean, we're good at everything, but what's the highest value agricultural products that Arizona's kind of uniquely good for? Should probably be a conversation, and I'm sure it is, right? Farmers think about this kind of thing all the time. So I think that's big. And then just honestly, like suburban economies, we don't use that much water. City of Scottsdale uses like 60 something thousand acre foot of water a year. It's like one decently sized farm's worth of water for all of the economic output of the city of Scottsdale. That's why I think ag urban is so great. Because if you're a farmer, right, who has the opportunity to sell some of your water to the ag urban, and you choose to do it, it's got to be voluntary. You choose to do it, right? Then you could participate in the economic value of that water when it goes to municipal use, which is, if you got 60,000 acre foot to sell, that means you're participating in the economic value produced by an entire city. And that can make you very wealthy. Regardless of what you want to do you want to take some of your land and focus on your best land and then use that to reinvest in your best land? Do that. Hell, if you want to retire and buy a mansion in PV and a Ferrari, do that. You want to go into a different line of business because hey, I'm going to sell my water rights. Maybe I'm going to start a factory. Maybe I'm going to start some sort of services business, whatever the case may be. You get a lot of seed capital for that. And it's really good for everybody, right? We have to stop going, hey, the government knows best. Because I see this, right? Like the establishment Republicans, they're very fixated on preserving like this idealized version of rural life, like that revolves around agriculture, and the Democrats are very focused on preserving this idealized to them, but I would probably say like dystopian, version of life where people like live in little boxes and don't use water, and water flows free across land or whatever. But the point is that everybody seems to be wanting to use water as a tool of social engineering, where me and a lot of the rest of the Freedom Caucus are just kind of sitting there going, water is for people. That was my favorite quote by Senator Wadsack, who was also very passionate about the issue. Water is for people. Okay, so how can we make sure that water is a tool that's available to people to maximize their freedom, right? To maximize their well-being as they see it, not as the government sees it, but as they see it, right? Whether that's the mansion in PV or running the farm for 1,000 years, right? Like we just want to give you the power to live your best life. And I think that's where all conservatives ought to be.
Well, now, we're getting into the political philosophy side of things. And there's a lot of good, juicy stuff in our exchange at your office the other day. So I'll be, as long as the footage and audio turned out well, that will be added to this interview. But we'll kind of seg into that direction. I'm curious.
I got about 15 minutes left.
15 minutes. Okay. Feel free to guide things if there's any points you want to make. But the questions I want to ask are kind of. Let me ask this one first. You're making a lot of points against a kind of top-down central control thing, but you're also saying, well, at the end of the day, the water's going to flow towards the majority of voters and the majority of money. Do you? Two questions here. First one, do you think that there's there's any role for like kinds of hard limits where you do want the government to be a gatekeeper in some sense. Like we're here's like a maybe an easy one, or I'd be curious to hear something like we should not be selling water to another state, right? Something like that. Or we shouldn't let Saudi Arabia be here to use water to grow alfalfa to export back home. Do you, I mean, or, do any of these kinds of like even really big picture things offend your free market sensibility, or you're like everything goes, and if you just put it on the free market, it's all going to kind of turn out for the best?
And see, again, it's the your question starts from a point that's off base, right? Like,
Okay.
why were the Saudis here growing alfalfa for their Saudi cows and using our water? Well, that's because the state leased them land. Well, why did the state lease them land in order to do that? Well, the state leased the land in order to do that because the state they it has a conception of highest and best use because they're required by law to lease the state land to basically to oversimplify to the person that will pay the most, right? Except that the state doesn't consider natural resource use when it's making those determinations. So will the Saudis pay $1 an acre more than the guy who doesn't want to strip mine the water out of the land? Great. The law says the state's got to give that land to them. That's stupid. Okay. Like, why can't we have a legal framework for the highest and best use of state trust land that takes into account the amount of state resources that you're using? Or even better, privatize land, but what do I?
There kind of lies for me the rub, because if we do complete privatization of groundwater resources, there's still nothing to stop the deepest pockets from saying, all right, well, it's private and it's up for grabs for anyone. We're Saudi Arabia. We're extremely wealthy. We can afford to pay more for that water than locals in Arizona. And do you feel at that
They,
point? Yeah.
what they wouldn't, right? And the reason that they
Hmm.
wouldn't is okay, if Saudi Arabia is bidding against Taiwan Semi for the water, okay, the economic output in terms of alfalfa for Saudi cows that an acre foot of water produces compared to the economic output that acre foot of water produces, building world leading semiconductors. It's like it's so far apart, right? That even the Saudis don't have the money to just subsidize alfalfa. So it wouldn't happen. Same thing if you replace Taiwan Semi with the city of Scottsdale. The economic output that acre foot is going to produce, if used for municipal use in the city of Scottsdale versus growing alfalfa for Saudi cows, it's so night and day that the Saudis are never going to actually be able to buy that water. The only reason it happens is because they don't have to bid against other water users, except for other water users that want to use the water on that particular land. And even then, the water use isn't being taken into account in the bidding.
Okay, so let's say we do have this market competition for water. Um, do you, it is, no matter what, it is a finite resource. And if it ever gets to a point where some private interest has just, they won the game of the market. They got their water resources because they could afford it. They got the sellers to agree to sell it. And now residential water users are endangered because they can't afford it. The city can't afford it. At that point, I mean, I'm just kind of exploring the edges here of your philosophy. At that point, is it fair for the state to step in and say, sorry, no matter what, we do have to have like a minimum amount of water to meet the basic needs of the people, and this free market system's not accomplishing that, so we're gonna have to like limit it in some ways.
I mean, I'm just kind of like struggling to grasp the concept of a water buyer so rich that they can lock up all of the water supply, despite the fact that the city of Scottsdale and the city of Phoenix and the city of Chandler and the city of Tucson are participating in the market. Like, I don't care if you're Elon Musk, right? Those are still some pretty heavy hitters to be competing against. Like Taiwan
I
Semi,
guess.
pretty heavy hitter to be competing against. Is like, what if this thing that can't happen did happen somehow? It's like, well,
Well,
it's a silly question.
well, I think about it you have to remember that I have a rural frame a lot of the time as I think about water.
Yes.
So it's less implausible that some deep-pocketed bidder might outbid rural residents, right? Like a 4,000 person town. That's kind of a different story. Or are you not worried about that happening either in an open market system?
Well, I would say this is that the town's got some land coverage over the basin, and it's probably that most towns depends on the specific geography, but most towns are going to have some land coverage over the basin, and on a pro rata basis, it's going to be less than the ag uses, so they are going to have access to that water.
Okay, well
Um,
that brings up a point did touch on in the previous conversation, which is if you do a correlative rights system, and again that is where a groundwater basin has its water supplies divided up amongst landowners in that basin per how much of the land they own, right? You own 1% of the land, you get 1% of the water. But in order for instance, a 4,000 person town like Wilcox for their correlated water rights to be meaningful sustainably into the future, the water levels can't keep going down indefinitely. And as far as I can tell, the only way to make sure that happens, that they actually have access to water, and that the water doesn't eventually one day, decades, 100, 200 years from now, get so low that you only have brackish water that they can't afford to treat. The only way to do that is to tie correlative rights to your safe yield supply rather than just the water in the ground.
or,
Because
or you
otherwise,
or you could tie it to the amount of water in the aquifer over 1,000 feet, or there's other ways to do it, right?
above 1,000 feet, you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And then so like I think that was what was in the legislation you proposed. Was it last year or the year before that I had looked
last
at?
year.
Last year, right? I think it was something along those lines where your correlative rights are correlated to safe yield plus the amount of water in the aquifer above 1,000 foot depth. Is that right?
I've had a lot of different versions, but I think that was one.
Okay. Um, and I guess my position is that makes some amount of sense to me. It would be in keeping with the long Arizona tradition of assured water supply. I personally feel that if a rural community wanted um, to try to target a stabilized level above 1,000 feet, that it should be within their rights to do that, because it's otherwise,
Who's right? Who's rights?
the people who live in there as represented by, let's say, a local committee. Otherwise, it's that 1,000 foot depth is just coming from Maricopa, coming from statute, and shouldn't, if it's going to be as arbitrary as some representative makes up this number, shouldn't local representatives be able to have a say in what they think
Cochise County has members of the Senate, members of the House. They have local representatives.
Yeah, yeah, kind of, but it's so you don't think that, for instance, a locally elected council should have much say in how groundwater regulations work out for a rural groundwater basin?
No, I'm always. I guess I'm less concerned with who has the say, although I do generally have a very strong conception of the legislature's role in the process. And more like, what kind of say are you going to assert over other people's water, right? Like this, it's kind of I think we need a system that gets us away from people that gets us away from the government having a say, right? This is my fundamental problem: is are we going to get closer to or further away from a system where the government doesn't have a say if we have more regulators in the system? And I think we get away from my ideal world the more regulators we have.
Well, I feel like it's like a really interesting political philosophy question. And to me, the problem, the mistake that gets made is that there's just this like, spectrum of we're closer, further away from state government control. And in my mind, it's really dependent upon the issue. I think, like, if you were to ask me personally about various policy topics, I would say in some cases less state control, in other cases the same amount, in other cases maybe a little bit more, because each policy topic is different. And I know we're running out of time here, so I'm gonna throw this at you, and then I'm gonna let you have the last word. Um, the idea that, and we touched on this in our previous conversation, this idea of what you call the water is special argument.
Hmm.
It's an argument that interestingly has very, very deep roots back to Roman law, where, for instance, like private property was treated very much as your private property. You have the final say. But in the first what is it called? The first like kind of codex of Roman law, where they took all of the court rulings and put it into a body of
The
text.
Justinian Code.
Yes, the Justinian Code. In book two, the very first law is that it basically forms the foundation for the public trust doctrine. It says water, air, coastlines. Now, I think maybe navigable waterways. Maybe that was later. These belong to the public. Everyone should have access to them. Thus, the state must manage them for the interests of the public. So the idea that water is special goes very far back into history, and I think the reason it is because you brought up the example of, like, you kind of compared water to copper in our previous conversation. And to me, these are very different issues because if private interests buy up my mineral rights under my lands, okay, whatever. If private interests buy up my water rights, and that means that my water levels start sinking and I don't have access to that water, that's a much, much different issue. And so, I'm just I'm curious to hear any argument that just says something along the lines of we should allow privatization of water, even if it means communities would lose access to their only water supply. I mean, I think it's a hard argument to make. I don't know if you're making it, but if you are, I'd be interested to hear it. And anything
I, I
else you
just
want
I,
to say?
I just fundamentally think that you're getting things backwards, right?
Mm,
Right now, the status quo right now is that the deepest pockets get all of the water. Okay. They have a much bigger pump than you and they run it 24/7 and they suck out your water. Okay. That's the
we
status quo
agree.
right now with the state
Yes,
managing the water.
we have
Okay.
state-sanctioned anarchy.
It, yeah. Almost, right? Almost. Okay. So it's anarchy because nobody owns the water, right? If you own the water under your land, they're not going to come and buy it up from under you. You have to sell it to them. And if you don't want to, then you don't, right? It gives you back the control. So I'm not going to make that argument because that's what's happening now. And that's one of the things I'm trying to fix with this proposal and this system. And I have voted for some of Gail Griffith's proposals to have these local bodies elected and regulate the water, not because I think they're a good idea, I think it's a terrible idea, but because I do want to I understand that we need to do something, right, in order to put the state in a strong negotiating position for the Colorado River use negotiations, right? And so I'm willing to bite off a limited extent of the
Yeah.
bullet I don't like in order to put the state in a strong position. Because at the end of the day, that's what's in the interest of my constituents to do.
Let me inject one quick thing real quick, just because I think it's a really important clarifying point. Um, Even if I choose not to sell my water, that doesn't mean that other landowners in my basin, for instance, like ranchers or whoever, who own enough land and enough of their correlated water rights, that if sold and if not restricted to something like safe yield, can sell enough water that our water level keeps going down because they sell more than safe yield. That means even if me and 90% of residential landowners in my basin decide to keep our water rights, we still see our water levels going down. And to me, that's like a hard no. That's like, no, you cannot give that much of the water up for grabs, where those who would prefer to keep their water rights and be able to access it at depth are unable to.
Your water table in Cochise County right now is dropping so fast that you literally have sinkholes opening up. Like,
Right.
this is
And we
the
need a
status
solution
quo
that
in
does
state
not,
management of your water.
and I don't want a solution that allows that to continue happening, is my point.
So under my solution, right, you would at least not have other people pumping up your water, right? There would always be a pool of water in that aquifer with your name on it that the big corporate interest couldn't touch.
But it might get so low that I can't access it anymore if we don't.
You might have to drop a bigger well, which guess what? You have to do anyway. But here's the other thing is the water's not going to get used as fast if everybody owns the water, because you only have as much, the big corporate interest, the big dairy or whatever, only use as much water as it has land coverage. And once it's done with that, it's got to buy more. That process takes time. And then it's got to think to itself, do we really want to, now that we can only use X water, does our current economic model work, or do we maybe need to do something else with the land? Right. And if they want to keep doing it, they got to go buy more and more people's land. And as you buy more and more people's water, and as you buy more and more people's water, okay, the price of that water continues to rise until becomes non-economically viable to run a dairy anymore at some point. And guess what? Then the pump shuts off. Okay.
Well, then they switch to vineyards.
Perhaps they do.
Yes.
Who knows, right? We don't know what a market's going to produce, except
roll the dice.
Except that what we do know about markets is it will produce far more efficient water use that'll protect your rights to water under your land, right? And that the people in Cochise County with the land are the best people to figure out how to use the water, because they're the people who are directly affected, have skin in the game. And therefore, the real vote that they should get is not for some council of regulators. The real vote that they should get is 100% vote over how their water gets used, right? That's power to the people. And that's what's really needed to fix this problem.
Well, I struggle with giving you the last word here, Alex, because I have so much to say. Maybe we'll have another conversation about it sometime. But I appreciate your time, and I look forward to other people being able to hear our conversation. I think people will learn a lot and a lot of new perspectives probably. And best of luck with your campaign. And until next time.
Until next time, always a pleasure, Christian. Talk to you soon.
Take care.